also should preface this by saying I never talk this long. As a lecturer, I don't lecture. I sort of ask questions, so I might have to take some breathing breaks and some water breaks because this is an endurance sport. But thank you, Calida and Doug, for bringing us together. And I also want to thank Calida for her remarks, and Dr. Bynum and Dr. Gordon for theirs. I'm going to do my best to build on their thoughts in this conversation. My background begins with a political science degree that was earned at the turn of the century. I love saying that because it brings people out. It's fun to think about it that way. Followed by a law degree, and then I made a mid-career pivot into arts and culture, and storytelling and technology. And for the past few years, I've been teaching world building and visualizing futures at ASU, Arizona State University. And I've been thinking a lot about what comes next and how we can make it better. So this conversation on lighthouses came into my life at a particularly tender moment. My father died at the end of April. And while I don't know that I would describe him as a lighthouse in my life, it's a bit more complicated than that. He was one of the few people I could drive across country with and not ever be annoyed or have a disagreement. He was a really funny guy, and he was absolutely my best friend. And that's probably because we were really similar. It also comes as I'm likely to transition out of the art sector in the coming months for many of the reasons we've talked about today. We work our staff to exhaustion. There's mission drift. The board structures are so difficult, and the mission often feels less tangible and urgent than it does ego-driven. I'll miss the beauty and intelligence of folks who work in the arts and the work itself, even if it is a little frustrating to me that beauty and intelligence often distracts from how little change we're really making. And so many of these problems arise because of the unique systemic space the arts occupy. I was trying to think of another public sector with less regulation and oversights than arts institutions. Maybe churches? I don't know if anyone out here can think of another one, but we have very little regulation or oversight. And I spent the first part of my career working in spaces that were heavily regulated. I was a government affairs professional or a lobbyist. And despite popular opinion, that actually is pretty regulated. We're not just wheeling and dealing and drinking around DC. And then I transitioned into nonprofit fundraising. And most of that work was with nonprofits that were in service of really, really deep human service missions. So I was working with unhoused families, teenage mothers, foster children, and food pantries all around DC. The urgency of these missions really put our work in stark relief. We knew that if we didn't do certain things, families would lose their homes, kids would end up with parents who didn't appreciate them or treat them like they deserved. So this was pretty intense work. And then exactly 10 years ago, when I started working at Fracture Atlas, which was sort of my transition to the arts, my first large meeting was convened by a super well-known foundation. They brought together 50 or 60 of us, executives, a really expensive way to spend an entire day, which I was, when you're working in shelters, it's like who can actually find the time to spend a whole day just talking about things, but that's what we did. So it's, researchers and program officers, executive directors, and we were just there to review some research they've done on the arts and health, artist health and well-being. And they shared data that showed that after the Affordable Care Act, every demographic of artists was suffering. They didn't have health insurance, they qualified for food stamps, they couldn't obtain housing, and also had this sort of myriad of emotional and mental health problems. The one outlier were married white women. So essentially in the arts, as everywhere else, where communities of color and people without access to what were suffering, women who were married tended to do better than everyone else because they had a safety net to fall back on. And there was someone else in their household who supported their creative practice. When we convened after the lunch break, the first point of order for the meeting was for folks to share their reflections. For me, having come from just working in one of the most well-known food pantries in DC, I shared that I was most struck by the fact that no one had said the word poverty. During the first half of the meeting, every single issue that we talked about and were dealing with was an issue related to poverty, and no one else could say the word. And I think that's emblematic of the sector. For whatever reason, we tend to segment ourselves out from other fields who are also dealing with poor people. And I've never really understood that. I don't know if it's on purpose, because once you work with poor people officially, you get regulated because then you're getting taxpayer dollars in a different way. But I still think it's strange, especially since we'll often say we're working with vulnerable populations. And so, having come from organizations where the mission was literally life or death, I'm always surprised at the hurried, rushed, and panicky tenor of life in arts institutions. Everyone's overworked, everybody's rushed. And sometimes I just straight up tell people there's no such thing as an arts emergency. Which brings me back to the prompt. I want to recall Lee's thoughts on the ways community existed before lighthouses. He said this gorgeous bit of words in his opening few paragraphs. Before there is a lighthouse, there's a shoreline. Before there's a keeper, there's a community. Before anyone builds a beacon, there are already people fighting their way through the dark. And that really resonated with me. Because the prompt also made me think about what existed before lighthouses. But my mind, which is probably legal, pragmatic, logical, went in a different direction because I was thinking about engineering and design and history as opposed to community. And as a person who's staunchly opposed to capitalism, but very good at it, I'm always thinking about the things and the technologies we've developed simply because Europeans needed to colonize things more efficiently. And for someone who works in futures, I spend a lot of time thinking about the past and how we got here. Both the way back when history and the relatively recent history, which, if we digest it quickly, can help us make better decisions at the most meaningful inflection point, which is right after something happens. So I think in order to talk about lighthouses, we have to first talk about empire. The technology that empire developed, the cultural and systemic damage it's wrought, and what we're left with as a result. What existed before lighthouses? How did we find our way in the dark? And to give my wife's former colleague Devin a shout out, what do we give and give up to belong to empire? I should insert a bit of a trigger warning here. Transparently, I'm really angry. I feel rage is burning inside of me when I think about empire, about colonization, about how much culture was violently stolen and erased from our planet. Thinking about the damage that capitalism has done to our planet, what we're leaving behind for future generations, really pisses me the fuck off. And some of you have learned earlier today, I curse a lot. I've got many vices that I'm working on, but swearing is not one of them. It's actually quite far down the list. So my apologies in advance for what might happen for the rest of the day. Oddly enough, I've spent a lot of time over the last decade thinking about how we navigated the stars before we had lighthouses. In 2017, I started a cooperative called Crux, which worked with Black artists all over the world as they dove deeper into immersive storytelling. And virtual reality, augmented reality, cool stuff like projection mapping, pretty much anything digital, games, we were into it. Crux was so named because it was the constellation that sailors in the South used to find their way home. So Europeans had the North Star, and we had Crux. It's also known as the Southern Cross, and it's the brightest star in the constellation in the southern sky. So if you're in Florida ever, you can pretty much look up and you'll see it at that particular, down there. And you sort of look at it and you can take its long axis and extend it 4.5 times, and that'll put you right at the South Celestial Pole. It's a really cool star. And we also know that the Polynesians have been the best sailors and navigators the world has ever known. It's incredible, and it was so much so that Europeans just didn't believe that it's possible that they could navigate without instruments. They simply lacked the skills to understand how a primitive culture could have traveled so far and wide. And I'll come back to legibility in a bit. But these navigators, who did some of the most sophisticated non-instrument wayfinding in human history, layered on far more than just one star. They tracked entire star paths, the sequence of stars rising and falling at fixed points over a course of a night. They memorized specific routes between islands. They read swell direction and the way that waves reflected off unseen land masses, watched bird flight patterns since certain species only go so far away from land. And they also noticed there were cloud formations that came up over islands. It's really fascinating. So the Southern Cross was just one reference point in a whole system and network of different signs that they had to follow and understand. And they paid such good attention to what the Earth and the ocean was telling them that they were able to successfully migrate and settle more than 1,000 scattered islands across the triangle between New Zealand, Hawaii, and Easter Island. And I've always loved the ocean. I spent the first part of my life living right on the beach in New Jersey. And I remember like summer nights, and the ocean would, have the window open, the ocean was in the background, and I'd lie awake and feel how the sand felt between my toes, which is actually everywhere because when you grow up on the beach, sand's like everywhere in your bed. I actually don't love sand at all now as an adult, but like it's nice to remember the scratchy feeling. But I always wondered what it would be like to sail beyond the horizon. And with people I knew and trusted, and maybe it's nighttime and the air is warm and salty and you're just sitting there in the darkness and it's just the moon and the stars. And it just sounded like the best adventure, and it's crazy as an adult to know that there were adults who did that without a compass. And that's the technology that got us along for most of human history. But I digress. The point is that long before lighthouses, we were successfully navigating the planet and finding our way. Bonfires on cliffs, shorelines, and on the very edges of land existed before lighthouses. And perhaps the most famous of these, the Pharos of Alexandria, was built 280 years before Christ. But the expansion of lighthouses is the result of shipping infrastructure that was at its most significant between 1600 and 1800, at exactly the same time and in the same places as shipping lanes and colonial trade routes. The routes moved valued goods, and we all know what those were. It was sugar, it was cotton, it was enslaved people, and manufactured goods that moved between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The British, the French, the Dutch, and the Spanish built lighthouses to protect the ships and protect their profit. A lighthouse on the African coast or in the Caribbean was infrastructure for an extraction economy. The concept of an artist, oddly enough, as I was researching this talk, developed around the same time. Transatlantic slavery and trade routes created the first class of truly wealthy people, and these people had surplus money and wanted status objects. So the consolidation of merchant capital meant that these folks could become patron of artists by commissioning music, portraits, and other artwork. And here's another bad habit of mine. I push back on prompts all the time. And that's probably something that's not going to change either. So in that vein, here's my question. What would it look like if artists and culture bearers refused to be lighthouses and instead became stars? After European and US colonization in the 1800s, so much of Polynesian wayfinding history was lost. Children in Hawaii were taught that wayfinding long distance was actually impossible without instruments, and that was part of their K-12 education. These sons and daughters of the sea and their non-binary nibblings were instead taught that their ancestors actually drifted directionless, and they accidentally stumbled on and then decided to settle the Pacific Islands. So last year, my wife and I were in Hawaii, and we learned about the Polynesian Voyaging Society. And in 1966, and in large part to refute European belief that they couldn't have done this massive feat without instruments. So exactly 50 years ago, they launched the first voyaging canoe to leave Hawaii for Tahiti in 600 years. The founders of the project believed that on the first voyage, they were facing cultural extinction. There was no navigator for their culture left. They had to go to a very, very small island, hundreds of miles away, to find someone who could still navigate that distance without instruments. But that person came and taught them how to do it. So by actually building towards the past, they were able to chart a new way forward in the future. So that's my answer to the prompt. It's not a lighthouse. We should probably look to be canoes, navigating by stars that were nearly lost, building towards the path to chart a new way forward. And so beyond that, what would it look like if our institutions refused to be legible to outsiders and instead focused on being legible to local communities? What would it look like if instead of participating in extractive capitalist systems, where the most oversight is held by those people who know us the least, we found our way back to intimacy with our closest supporters and our contributors? What would it look like if we chose to engage in conversations with our colleagues about what it meant for each person to have enough, rather than a conversation about our salary and pay scale? To go beyond simple board structures to normalizing shared leadership models at the staff level that prioritize multiple voices at all levels of an organization. And finally, what happened to not being afraid of the dark? Darkness shrouds, darkness is safe, inhibitions fall away, experimentation can happen in the dark. Not everything needs to be legible to everyone. My first job after college was working as a grants and communication coordinator for an organization called the Communications Network, whose mission at that time, this is dating myself once again, was to convince foundations that they needed a website and should produce an annual report. From that call for transparency in the early aughts, we've moved to scale, oversight, competition, and most recently, surveillance. I consult often, and the relationship between board and staff and community seems to be more fraught than ever before. I I think it's structural, and that many of the suggestions that have been shared over the past few weeks and today get us closer to more sustainable and healthy people, communities, and organizations. I also don't believe that in this political climate, many of our organizations, and especially those that are doing the deepest, most impactful work with the most historically exploited and extracted communities, can have both legibility and safety. We're far past the time when we can have it both ways, so it's time for us to make structural changes that fundamentally shift our relationship and our institutions. So once we accept that, what changes do we make to our governance structures? Do we have more honest conversations about board service, who it's for, and who it should serve? When I was at Fractured Atlas, we had a project that used David Duke's name. Y'all know who David Duke is, right? Okay, just checking. As a parody, and one of our board members voiced their strong concern that the project might offend David Duke. I would argue that if David was offended by our work, we're probably on the right track. The word hypernormalization was coined by a professor of anthropology who was born in the Soviet Union. He said that everyone in the Soviet Union knew the system was failing, but no one could imagine any alternative to the status quo, and politicians and citizens alike were resigned to maintaining the pretense of a functioning society. Over time, the mass delusion became a self-fulfilling prophecy, with everyone accepting it as a new norm rather than pretend. And that's what hypernormalization is. It strikes me that the cure for hypernormalization is a medicine in 3 parts. The first, being able to see that a system is failing and being honest enough to admit it out loud. The second is being willing to offer alternatives. And the third, taking some sort of action to prevent the self-fulfilling prophecy from happening. I think this series of conversations is well exceeding my expectations for the first 2 doses of the medicine. It's up to all of us to administer the third in the weeks, months, and years ahead. The founders of the Polynesian Voyaging Society didn't wait for someone to build them a lighthouse. They built the canoe, they found a navigator, and they sailed by starlight back to themselves. And that's what I'm asking all of us to do.